Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. This week, the podcast will go over our usual 30 minutes because the information provided by my guest is very important, and I want you to be able to hear all of it. So I'm very pleased to welcome Coleen Rowley to Wider View. Coleen is an FBI whistleblower who exposed the missteps within that agency prior to 9/11 and the subsequent cover-up, including the failure of higher-ups to follow through on the investigation of Zacarias Moussaoui by the Minneapolis field office where she worked. Coleen worked for the FBI for 24 years and was named Person of the Year by Time magazine in 2002. So welcome to Wider View, Coleen Rowley.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we'll start with your experience in the FBI. I thought it would be especially important to talk with you following the recent testimony of former FBI Director Robert Mueller before Congress. And Democrats have spent 2 years extolling the virtues of Director Mueller. But since you worked for him, at least indirectly, maybe we could start by your telling us who is Robert Mueller and why was he chosen for this particular role?
Well, Mueller was a more or less career DOJ prosecutor in different capacities, and also somewhat of a revolving door with big law. You know, they call it big law in Washington, D.C., which a lot of it is actually lobbyists and connected with military-industrial complex. But those big law firms, you know, the officials tend to go back and forth between government and private corporations and big law. He was mostly in government, however, and he became director just a few days before 9/11. He could not be blamed, of course, for these failures that I exposed. Actually, I only exposed part of the failures because there was a lot more in other offices, etc., that I didn't even know completely about. But he became director, and he can't be blamed for that failure to read information, to share intelligence, and then to act on it, which the Director of Central Intelligence was said to have his hair on fire. There was so much intelligence pouring in that an attack was going to occur, and they mostly disregarded it. He can't be blamed for that because he was not FBI director. However, after 9/11, he went along with what all of those other directors, Tenet especially, who knew a lot of this intelligence. Tenet was the Director of Central Intelligence, and he knew it. And Mueller went along in protecting and covering up about that. He would go out in public and say, we had no idea that Al-Qaeda was going to attack. If we had had some information, we could have maybe stopped it. He said along the lines of Condi Rice, we didn't know planes would fly into buildings. So we immediately tried to correct his public statements because, of course, we knew that a terrorist was in custody in the month before 9/11. And that headquarters had failed to act on that. So, you know, why would you be saying that we had no information? And he proceeded after 9/11 then in a whole variety of cover-ups and the really wrong actions of the so-called war on terror that actually then served to increase terrorism. And I wrote an article about this about a week after, or a few days after Mueller was appointed special counsel, because it seemed like everyone in the United States of amnesia had just forgotten this really long, really sordid track record that Robert Mueller had after 9/11. And these were all publicly known things, where inspector generals had criticized him for doing terrible things. Some of these things had made, covers of newspapers. So I just will highlight a couple of them. I really kind of touched on just some of the things that people should have kept in perspective when Mueller was named as special counsel. After 9/11, in order to continue to really make the FBI look like they were doing something and, cover up the fact that they had enabled the attacks to occur by failing to share intelligence, Mueller was ordered a roundup of immigrants mostly in New York. And every day we had to report how many of immigrants were in custody. So people have forgotten all about this. It had started right after 9/11, and it got up every day, 100, 200. It was going up for several months, and they were held in jail. Some of them were beat up. None of them were terrorists. So there's one episode right there. He rounded up people that were not terrorists, and by pretending that they got beat up in jail and everything. Eventually, I think most of them got deported because they were just people that were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mueller knew that the NSA, shortly after 9/11, turned on massive surveillance illegally on Americans. And he also knew that the CIA had begun to torture, to kidnap different people. And then, of course, Guantanamo resulted as later on, years later. But when nobody knew this was going on, Mueller went to the ACLU, to these various venues, because, people were concerned. They were all worried about the Patriot Act at the time, and especially the civil liberties people were worried. And he would go and give a speech, and they would clap for him. He would say, the FBI will uphold the Constitution and civil liberties, and these ACLU audiences would clap, while he knew that they were illegally monitoring Americans and also torturing people all over the world. And the only thing he did on the torture, which is completely illegal, and the FBI, of course, I was trained that you could never coerce a confession because it would be unreliable. I mean, this was something that was drilled into the FBI. And yet Mueller he only said, if you watch somebody, the CIA, for instance, torturing, just don't record it, and get out of you can leave the room if you want to, but don't make a case of it, etc. So that's what was going on. There's other really significant failures of Mueller. He and Comey both fingered the wrong person to be the anthrax killer. They targeted this poor guy, Hatfill, and went after him and made his life miserable, as has occurred in the past as well. But eventually, Hatfill was able to prove his innocence and got $5 million from the taxpayers, and actually that can be attributed in some large part to Mueller and Comey. So that was one thing, completely wrong. I mean, you're talking completely wrong. There's also a lot of indications, if you go way back in Mueller's career, that he knew about the fact that the FBI was operating the Whitey Bulger murderer in Boston. The FBI operated a top echelon Irish mobster who was murdering people. And eventually they even the FBI helped frame 4 innocent people for the same murders that they knew Bulger was committing. And Mueller had some role in that, although the documents have mysteriously disappeared because he was the acting U.S. attorney in Boston when these 4 guys were trying to prove their innocence. And eventually, here's another big taxpayer loss. Eventually, when they did prove that they were innocent, and this came out about this sordid thing about operating Whitey Bulger, the government had to pay $110 million to those 4 guys, wow. 2 of whom had died in prison. Now, I wrote this all, a week after Mueller was named. I said, don't you remember? Why are you putting your hope and faith and trust in this guy as if he's, up on a pedestal along with James Comey? Because these guys have actually been involved in a whole lot of bad things. I will accept that if you become a leader or a director of any agency, you're going to make mistakes. I mean, that's obviously, these are high pressure positions, and there's a lot of pressure to be a sycophant and to go along with power. And so there's no doubt that people always, and we're human, we're just human. I don't begrudge his making mistakes, but his whole entire career is basically a Peter principle, where, the expensive suits and the fact that he was very likable, extremely likable, and made friends with with Brennan and Comey and dozens of other officials, because they're all kind of in a club in a way. And some people are more likable than others. And I will say a lot of people liked him. He had he was likable. But he was also a sycophant. And when the power wanted him to do something, for instance, start the war on terror, start the war on Iraq, which actually increased terrorism, they gave him a piece to read, linking Saddam to 9/11 and to terrorism, and he dutifully reads it. Basically, he's part of the lie then that ends up also killing hundreds of thousands of people. People that, by the way, Iraqis had nothing to do with 9/11, and in fact, they were enemies of Al Qaeda, and
right.
Yet you would never know this because all of these officials, and Mueller was one of them, were not telling the truth. So why would you put somebody who has that kind of a reputation in charge of, in theory, trying to conduct an objective investigation? If there is, if there was a reason for that, for it to begin with, you would never. We have 1 million attorneys in the United States. You would never pick someone who had a conflict of interest, who was great friends with Comey, and that his firing is one of the things that they claim is, part of the obstruction. So why would you put his best friend in charge who has this record? But yet, you know what? Nobody listened. Nobody read. Very few people, because partisanship is the name of the game right now. And very few people even read that article. It was entitled, "Comey and Mueller are not Russiagate heroes," something like that. Should not be the Russiagate heroes. And
they didn't take your advice, obviously.
well, it's people. It's the sad thing is if there were enough now, by the way, all these years later, after well over 2 years later, I think it dawned on a lot of people watching Mueller testify recently, finally, that he's not this great Sherlock Holmes detective that they attributed to having all this wisdom and ability. I think now they have, that was pretty obvious when he testified for 7 hours and couldn't answer questions and didn't even know what was in his report. Right. However, that should have been obvious a long time before, if you even remembered any of that track record. Any of his prior track record. And it's amazing that when partisanship and emotional, I would say it's called, emotional manipulation of people, the hatred, now it's Trump derangement syndrome. And by the way, I'm not a big fan. I did not vote for Trump, and I'm not a big fan of him. But I'm also think that you need facts and logic. You just cannot proceed based on hatred and irrational emotionalism, and you can't forget history, for instance, in this case.
Well, and one of the things that strikes me, you touched on it, but, to have chosen him, to me, it makes me question the original allegations. In other words, what was it that spurred this investigation in the first place, and where did that information originate? And I think that is something that, is worth talking about too, because it comes from that same club that you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The club, a lot of people call it the deep state or the shadow government, the military, industrial, congressional, media, academic, propagandist complex. So these powerful figures in Washington, D.C. I should also say sometimes people call them the swamp.
Right.
The swamp. This group of very powerful figures, it can exert a lot of pressure. In the old days, J. Edgar Hoover was the swamp. Basically, we had one guy that had more power than presidents, for 47 years. But now it is distributed amongst a lot of powerful people, a lot of, wealthy campaign contributors are part of this, etc. So I would say that if you we can hope that this U.S. Attorney Dunham, Attorney General Barr, and the Inspector General Horowitz, who are now investigating the origins of how this debacle over 3 years that we call Russiagate, how this all got legs and it got started. And I don't have a lot of hope. I said on Facebook today, I said, don't hold your breath, that this will be completely, they'll get to the bottom of it. I actually am more cynical now. I think they may get a few quote unquote bad apples. You know, people like Strzok and Page and McCabe, it's possible that they will, Chris Steele, you know, that maybe they will, you know, just get the bottom of the level here. However, it's a lot more than that. It's kind of like Abu Ghraib, where they end up indicting just the worst Grenier, these lowest level people, when in fact the orders for Abu Ghraib came from the top, from Rumsfeld. And they, of course, never get to the top. You know, they end up, you know, just going for the few bad apples at the bottom. But here's what happened. You know, it starts with the Steele dossier that is deliberately leaked to some sympathetic reporters that, you know, people thought had credibility, David Korn and Isikoff and others. And they spread this already in the fall, long before Trump is president, that he was elected because Russia colluded with him, etc. So the Steele dossier is completely concocted. There doesn't look to be anything to it other than what appeared in public news articles. So they Steele apparently incorporated some items, for instance, that Carter Page went to Moscow, which everyone knew because that was he saw it in the news. So this gets incorporated as if the Russians are somehow operating Carter Page. And he makes up this whole dossier, with a lot of icky sex things in it, et cetera, in order to smear Trump for dirt for Hillary Clinton, because he was being paid by Hillary Clinton.
Right.
So this horrible thing, then it gets leaked. The FBI gets it. Brennan is part of this. He runs with it. He starts things because he's also very partisan, and he wanted Hillary Clinton to be elected. By the way, I really doubt they'll get to the Brennan because he's still very powerful and connected. But so then the next step is that Brennan and Comey write up with a few special hand-selected analysts. They write up the intelligence assessment, ICA. And this ICA then is done right before Trump takes office. And they brief him with it a couple of days. And they set it up so that that Brennan and the NSA director leave the room, and they leave Comey deliberately alone. That's the funny part, because that was a whole setup to leave Comey alone with Trump a couple of days before he took office. And later on, Comey said he was afraid to be left alone with Trump. Well, he was part of this thing where they set him up. And then what he did was, it was kind of almost like a blackmail attempt that they did with Martin Luther King, that Hoover had conducted with Martin Luther King Jr., where he now reads this really horrible part of the Steele dossier. And he tells Trump, and by the way, this is going to leak to the public. So, of course, Trump doesn't know what to do. And then he has Comey, of course, as his FBI director. And later on, when Comey was telling Trump, "You're not the target of this investigation," he was assuring Trump personally, in private, that he was not the target. And then it came out that, in fact, the FBI had, in fact, McCabe, by that time, McCabe is the acting director, has launched an investigation of Trump directly. And so, that's, I think, part of the reason Comey gets fired, because Trump realized that he's not been telling me the truth. I'm actually the target of this investigation. Well, of course, Trump overreacts. Who would not overreact at that point? He then, of course, and Trump hasn't has a narcissistic personality. He is a bit like Napoleon, and which is scary, by the way, because you don't want to push a rabid Napoleon into a corner. That person is going to tend to overreact, and they may do something. I'm really afraid right now that, by the way, all these years later, that Trump does have a persecution complex, by the way, rightly so, and that he may well want to prove himself by starting war in Iran and even possibly even using nuclear bombs. Because you're making somebody this way, and it's kind of hard. People don't understand this, but these powerful people are inherently a little bit dangerous when they have this kind of power. And somebody that is a narcissist like Trump is, this Russiagate did not help. Put it that way. It just was not helpful at all.
Yes, and I can understand. Obviously the reason. The motivation to get rid of Trump is, of course, perfectly understandable. But there's a second piece here, and this is the piece that even after the Mueller report and the hearing is still out there. And those are the indictments that the Mueller team made of Russian citizens. The first being the Internet Research Agency and Concord Management, who are accused of trying to sow discord in the U.S. political system and through Facebook posts and ads or whatever. And then 12 members of the Russian intelligence, or GRU, who are accused of hacking the email servers of the Clinton campaign and the DCCC and turning the results over to WikiLeaks. There's, I don't think Mueller expected to ever have to have discovery motions in those particular cases. But is there sufficient evidence to back up those allegations, do you think?
Well, we know really, or have a very good idea, that Mueller himself was not competent to either to write these indictments or to prosecute, etc. He had these 18, 19 sharp attorneys, young attorneys working for them, some of whom, by the way, have been overturned in the course of their prior careers. Some of them were partisans for Hillary Clinton, attended her victory party and everything else. They're the ones who realized that going after a foreign country is going to be very popular, especially after the media was already seeded this way, for a year and a half, et cetera. Nobody's going to be against demonizing Russia. Right. And in fact, very few people are going to be against demonizing WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has stepped on everyone's toes by now because they publish truthful, authentic documents. And the documents themselves reveal how bad a lot of different people from even a lot of different countries, by the way, not just the United States, even Russia. WikiLeaks published a lot of documents that show Russia to be doing wrong things. And so, but what happens is that people are not going to like you. That's really opposite of, for instance, Mueller, where everybody likes him because he goes along and he covers things up. But if you're WikiLeaks and you're publishing honest stuff and truthful documents, people are going to stop liking you. And it gets to a point where if there is a way to demonize WikiLeaks, and, of course, Pompeo and the rest want to, many powerful American officials would like to see Julian Assange executed, at this point. So these two prongs were very popular. And all you had to do, those sharp attorneys, was to, quote unquote, indict the ham sandwich. Because by indicting the GRU, for instance, Russian military people or whatever, there's almost no way that they're going to be able to come into the United States and fight the case. And I don't think they have. I think that indictment is just basically stands. It's like indicting somebody in a foreign. By the way, this is not in the past. Indicting people in the John le Carre world of espionage almost never happened. And it almost never happened. Yes, indict indict, for instance, the Israeli who was caught spying here in the United States. I mean, yes, if you could catch them in the United States, then they would at least be traded for an American spy. The Le Carre world did not involve criminal law enforcement. It involved the world of intelligence. So this was almost never done. But these sharp attorneys realized, okay, we can indict, we can put this in here, and nobody's going to be the wiser. Who's going to know about date stamps and whether we had evidence of GRU actually hacking these places or not? And I should also mention both countries, not only Russia and the United States, but pretty much any country in the world who can afford this kind of surveillance equipment, does it. Of course, we know now from the Snowden things, the United States spies on its allies. They were listening into Angela Merkel on her own cell phone. If a country has a lot of money and wants to try to control through surveillance, by the way, the surveillance is used for blackmail. There's a great new documentary out called Official Secrets. I would recommend it to everyone. It's with one of my truth teller colleagues, Catherine Gunn, who was a real young lady working in one of the British spy agencies. And before the war in Iraq, the United States wanted to get dirt on the UN, on the United Nations Security Council members. They wanted to get dirt on those Security Council members in order to leverage them, i.e. blackmail them into supporting the United States war on Iraq. And what they did is they were going to turn on surveillance on them. Catherine Gunn knew about it. And then this documentary, there's a great actress, I forget her name now, but she's a well-known actress who plays Catherine Gunn. This movie is just coming out right now. I have a feeling Official Secrets probably won't play in a lot of theaters because it'll be politically incorrect. But she's the one who blew the whistle. So this spying stuff that goes on of officials all over the world. And the United States is obviously, because we have the biggest budget, I mean, a budget that is many, many, many times that of Russia or China or whatever. Hacking is involved, by the way, hacking, surveillance, intercepting foreign officials, etc. And so when we indict them it's possible that, the GRU was spear phishing on officials. That, I would, if I was a betting person, I'd say that they probably were, but so is the United States and so are many other countries. That indictment seems to be, like I said, it just out there and nobody has real good evidence. Mueller and his sharp attorneys didn't have much evidence either. The other indictment, however, surprised the Department of Justice, who now has to follow through on this indictment. The Concord. Concord was the owner of the Internet Research Agency, and they came in and actually hired attorneys in Washington, D.C. to fight it. And just about 2 weeks before Mueller testified, there was a very interesting development in that case, which is that the judge in the United States versus Concord prosecution came really close to finding that Mueller and Barr, because Barr repeated it too, had committed criminal contempt by extrajudicial prejudicial statements that they were making that made it seem, and by the way, this is even in the Mueller report too, they made it seem that these Russian individuals working in the Internet Research Agency, which is a troll farm, a clickbait, lots and lots of private, groups are doing this. They try to get you to click because then they can sell your information. I mean, they can get you interested in selling you something, etc. It's called clickbait. And so this IRA that was indicted as somehow influencing the election through Facebook ads, $40,000 worth of Facebook ads, got really exagerated. And Zuckerberg helped that along. They all went in and claimed that it had reached over a million people, when in fact it had not. And now Mueller, by implying that this was the Russian government, he and Barr implied or conveyed the misleading impression that it was the Russian government. And so the judge had actually warned Mueller that he was not to do this. When I was listening to Mueller, one of the reasons I listened to this excruciating 7 hours of testimony was that I wanted to see if he would mess up, and or if any of the congresspersons would mess up and basically ask him about the Russian government meddling involved in the Concord case. And actually a couple did. There were a couple of congresspersons who came really close to implying that Concord and IRA were connected to the Russian government. And Mueller never corrected it. So I'm kind of looking for that those attorneys that are hired by Concord to now say, hey, you know what, Judge, you warned him not to make prejudicial, extrajudicial statements, but guess what? He's kind of continuing to do that. But we'll see. I don't know if that will happen or not.
Right. It's not clear. Well, one last thing that I want to ask you, and that is about the possibility of obstruction of justice charges against Trump. And you were, of course, counsel to the FBI office in Minneapolis for many, many years. And I assume that in that your role was to work with agents to determine whether they had sufficient evidence for indictment. Do you think that, do you think that an obstruction case is warranted or possible at this point against Trump?
Yeah, let me explain a couple things about, there's two statutes that have been widely used and or referred to. One is false statements to the FBI. That's Title 18, Section 1001. It's always in small print when people fill out applications for government, either government aid or grants or anything like that. And basically, it's not used to prosecute. That's the key thing here. Title 18, 1001 was extremely rare to ever prosecute someone for lying to the FBI. Even in cases like where the parents of a fugitive would lie to protect their son, for instance. Let's say their son murdered his wife or something like that, and they were helping their son hide out. That was a very common scenario. And in those cases, you'd want to prosecute the parents because they're lying. They're impeding you finding some guy who's murdered his wife, etc. And so there were compelling cases for prosecuting. And even in those cases, Title 18, 1001 was almost never prosecuted. Its use was as a warning. And so if you thought someone was lying to you, and we were taught this in the first few weeks of training school, that you could use that to impress on people that they had to tell the truth. You could say, hey, but by the way, there is a law that you could be prosecuted for not telling the truth to the FBI. So it had that use. And even there was even a Supreme Court case. There was case law that made it seem that if you just merely denied committing a crime, that it would be too close to the right against self-incrimination, the Fifth Amendment,
right,
that it could not be prosecuted. And then that went away. Supreme Court said, nah, we'll say that you can be prosecuted if you merely deny committing a crime. Only a year, right around 9/11. I don't know if it was a year or two before or after, but it was right around that same time. So, of course, it was never prosecuted because a lot of people will deny when the FBI comes knocking at their door. First thing out of their mouth is they're going to deny the crime. So that's one thing. And so these indictments that the Mueller team, by the way, the team more than Mueller, was able to get of people for lying to the FBI are really close to entrapment because it's very simple matter to get people to lie to the FBI. Almost everyone does, by the way. So that's for starters. Now, the other thing is obstruction. And I just mentioned the case of the fugitive and everything. Normally obstruction would be tacked on to someone who has committed a crime. And it could just be that they want to tack on another additional thing. Not only did they do this, maybe it's not such a serious crime, but they also obstructed it. In white collar cases, et cetera, if they shred the documents, et cetera, that would be the standard classic case. Then there could also be a case, for instance, in the Martha Stewart case, where where Martha did not commit the underlying crime, but it was a close colleague that committed the crime. And
Right.
so because you can't get Martha herself for committing the underlying crime, she's protecting a close colleague or a family member. Nixon did that. Nixon, wasn't part of, ostensibly he was not part of the burglary, the Watergate burglary, but he was protecting his administration. So that could be a second one. But Mueller talking about a possible case of obstruction against Mueller, and by the way, all the other partisan Democrats talking about this, is a whole nother stretch. Because what they're saying, I heard one of the congresspersons ask Mueller, and he said, well, if Trump was trying to prevent embarrassment, that was actually in one of the little slides they put up. Not only protecting himself or protecting his administration, but to prevent embarrassment of himself. Well, you know what? Every innocent person, if they're falsely alleged, will be trying to prevent embarrassment. I mean, this is carrying this next step that they're talking about obstruction when Mueller's team could not find that any American, not just Trump, but not any American had actually conspired with the Russians to commit whatever, espionage or meddling with the election, etc.
Right.
If they can't find any crime like that, then to say, well, but by firing Comey and making public statements, it's a witch hunt, etc., that is trying to prevent embarrassment, unbelievable. And we're probably going to be waiting years for some legal scholar who's far more articulate than myself to explain that this just on a legal basis alone, when this notion that you could be guilty of obstruction if you did not commit the crime and you merely were trying to prevent embarrassment after being accused falsely through the dossier, etc., of nonsense. We'll have to wait and see if we ever get any law professors with enough integrity to try to explain that this will turn all of criminal justice on its head, totally on its head, when you carry it to this extreme. Wow. But we're going to be waiting. I'm afraid we're going to be waiting for a while for that.
Yeah, we may be. Yes, we may be waiting for a long time. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, and I could go on for, probably another hour or two, but I think we're going to have to call it quits here. But I really appreciate your input on this, and I think it's very, very enlightening, and I hope we can get this message out to as many people as possible. I know you're appearing on a lot of alternative media recently, and I'm very happy to see that.
Because the propaganda has so brainwashed people, it takes a while to explain this.
Right.
You have to kind of explain it simply because you have to really back up, because people, like I said, they don't remember anything, and they don't understand. They don't, because our news, our public television and public radio, they are doing a horrible job of helping the propaganda and the brainwashing.
It's incredible. I mean, I listened to a couple of your reactions, I think Real News and someplace else that you were speaking, that I found the video online. And of course, I listened to 2 or 3 of Aaron Mate's reports.
Yep.
And then I happened to listen to a report on NPR while I was driving a couple of days ago, and I was taken aback. I was like, "Is this? Are we talking about the same period?" Yeah. I mean, this doesn't sound remotely like what I'm hearing. And they were going on about how great it was, and how it was so damning to Trump and all this kind of stuff. And I go like, whew, I don't know. Anyway.
It's because people are in their own bubbles now.
Yeah.
We have really divided up, and people are only listening to what they reinforces their prior, whatever. So that's the problem.
Yeah, it really is. Everybody has their own set of facts.
Yep.
Well, anyway, I won't keep you any longer, but that was former FBI whistleblower Coleen Rowley, and I really appreciate her being willing to talk with me here on Wider View. So if you enjoyed this podcast and I would invite you to follow us both here and on Facebook at Wider View Radio. And I'd like to hear from you. You can certainly email me at widerviewradio@gmail.com. And this is your host, Charles Dunaway. Thank you for listening.